Chapter 10. To understand the present U.S. educational system, its successes and failures, and the problems it still faces, we must look to our past. There we can identify the forces that have affected and continue to affect the development of American education. This chapter reviews the history of schooling and education in the United States, pointing out 7 important themes and examining the contributions that significant men and women have made. Where are the college students who feel a burning urgency to answer the question, what is the history of American education? Unless you are a history buff, you will probably ask yourself, why do I need to know this stuff? How will it help me do a better job in the classroom? First, understanding American educational history will give you a sense of perspective. As educators, we are sometimes accused of being faddists, which implies that we blindly follow each new approach or idea, thinking it's the greatest thing since the internet. At the other extreme, we are sometimes accused of reinventing the wheel, spending a great deal of energy discovering something that has been in educational literature for years or was a significant part of the education program of a different culture. Second, studying this history of American education will enable you to better understand the cultures and contexts in which you will work. It will help you see the big picture, that is, why things operate as they do in today's schools. Finally, studying the history of education will help you appreciate its truly noble heritage. Schools have been a progressive instrument in the lives of most people who have attended them. They have freed people from superstition and false information and given them new skills, positive values, and world-expanding visions about each individual as well as what we as people can become. Some of the greatest people who have walked the earth, Socrates, Jesus, and Gandhi, among others, saw themselves essentially as teachers. Teachers, then, are part of a long-lived, progressive, and inspirational human endeavor. Knowing our educational history and gaining a historical perspective will help you live up to and extend this tradition. Kindergarten or nursery school led to elementary school, then to middle school or junior high school, then to high school, and now to college. You may have taken this progression for granted, assuming that that's the way things have always been. In reality, you are presently enjoying a level of education that was available only to the elite of earlier generations. You are already close to the top of an educational pyramid for which the foundation was laid almost 350 years ago. The growth of the pyramid has been shaped and energized by 7 major themes in American educational history. Local control, originated in New England during colonial times, the concept of local control of schools spread during the 19th century with the formation of the school district system. Because of their fear of a too strong federal government, the framers of the U.S. Constitution made no reference to education. As a result, state governments assumed the role of educational authorities and then delegated substantial powers to local school boards. Not until the mid-20th century did the federal government become substantially involved in educational matters. Universal education. Education for all children has been a developing theme in the United States. In the colonial period, education was reserved for a small minority, mainly white males. During the 19th century and 20th century, children from various groups previously omitted from educational opportunities gained access to elementary and secondary education. Today, a college education is generally available to all who actively seek it. Public education. In the colonial period, education was generally private and primarily reserved for the middle and upper classes. Today, private education remains a small and important part of the overall education system, but nationhood for the United States brought the expansion of publicly supported education. By the early 20th century, not only was public education widespread, but education became compulsory as well. Comprehensive education. The basic abilities to read, write, and do arithmetic were once sufficient to prepare most children for fulfilling their adult roles in society. Eventually, the growth of urban industrial life in the United States during the 19th and early 20th centuries demanded that people be educated for work. The result was the comprehensive public high school, which includes both training for trades and preparation for college. Secular education. In the earliest colonial times, the purpose of education was religious training. Beginning in the 18th century and progressing through the 20th century, the function of American education became increasingly secular, concerned with producing socially responsible citizens. Religious study has remained mainly in the private sector. Changing ideas of the basics, literacy and classical learning were the main goals of colonial education, whereas practical skills for a pragmatic, democratic society were the aims of 19th century schools. Technical and scientific literacy were added to the basics in the computer age and space age of the late 20th century. Today, preparing students to compete in a global in a global marketplace seems to be the focus. Expanding definitions of educational access and equality. In the 19th century, the goal for educational access was to build schools in places where children lived and to enroll as many of them as possible. Since then, the focus on equality of educational opportunity has expanded. By the beginning of the 20th century, efforts to equalize education involved offering more curricular choices, including vocational training, to help prepare students for different economic and social roles. Throughout the middle of the 20th century, the focus was on removing legal, racial, and economic barriers to schooling. From the 1960s to the 70s, access and educational opportunity became redefined as they became increasingly tied to results. The removal of racial, linguistic, mental, and physical discrimination as the basis for expanded access was augmented by a focus on measuring learning outcomes among different groups as a test of whether improved access led to real educational opportunity. As one educational historian noted, by the end of the 20th century, expectations had shifted to an emphasis on academic achievement. During the first decade of the 21st century, the emphasis on academic achievement has continued. Most contemporary educational issues have their roots in these 7 themes, which continue to shape the character of American schooling and education. Consider these examples of current issues. Local control. What should be the role of the federal government regarding education? Should federal legislation, such as the No Child Left Behind law, require states to test students in particular grades and on particular subjects? Universal education. How can we ensure the quality of education regardless of whether students live in wealthy or poor school districts? Public education. Should private and religious schools receive public tax support? Comprehensive education. Should the schools require all students, vocational and college prep, to follow a common curriculum? Secular education. How should public schools treat the presence of religion in American society and world culture? Changing ideas on the basics. Is technological literacy a new basic of education? If so, how will schools finance the programs that train students to use new technologies? Expanding definitions of equal access and opportunity. What should schools do about achievement gaps between poor and minority students and students from white or wealthier families? These are just a few of the issues facing today's policymakers. As you read the rest of this chapter, look for links between historical faces and the key topics and debates in contemporary education. This chapter's tour through history is not intended to be a dead-end journey into the past. What happened in earlier generations has greatly influenced the schooling you received and the system you will enter as a teacher. Elementary education changed dramatically from the colonial period to today. Schooling became compulsory rather than optional. Schools went from being religiously oriented to having a secular focus, and schools today are bright, colorful, and friendly environments in contrast to the overly strict and punitive schools of the colonial era. In the 1600s, some girls received elementary education, but formal colonial education was intended mainly for boys, particularly those of the middle and upper classes. Both girls and boys might have had some preliminary training in the 4 R's: reading, writing, arithmetic, and religion. At home, sometimes for a small fee, a housewife offered to take in children to whom she would teach a little reading and writing, basic prayers, and religious beliefs. In these dam schools, girls also learned basic household skills such as cooking and sewing. The dam schools often provided all the formal education some children, especially girls, ever received. Throughout the colonials, poor children were often apprenticed or intended to local tradesmen or housewives. Apprenticeships lasted 3 to 10 years, generally ending around age 21 for boys and age 18 for girls. During that time, an apprentice would learn the basic skills of a trade that might also be taught basic reading and writing and perhaps arithmetic as part of the contractual agreement. Although the lines were not drawn hard and fast, the 3 geographic regions of the colonies, New England, the South, and the Middle colonies, developed different types of educational systems, which were shaped by each region's particular settlement patterns. In New England, the Puritans believed it was important that everyone be able to read the Bible and interpret its teachings. As early as 1642, Massachusetts passed a law requiring parents to educate their children. That law was strengthened in 1647 by the famous Old Dual Der Satan Act. Because Satan assuredly would try to keep people from understanding the scriptures, it was deemed important that all children be taught how to read. Therefore, every town of 50 or more families was obligated to pay a man to teach reading and writing. With these schools, also known as town schools, New England set the precedent that if parents would not or could not educate their children, the government was obligated to take on that responsibility. When settlements spread out seeking better farmland, the town schools began to disappear. What emerged in their place was the so-called moving school, in which a schoolmaster traveled from village to village holding sessions in each place for several months before moving on. Discontent with this system of education eventually led to the development of the district school. Under this scheme, a township was divided into districts, each having its own school and teacher and being funded by the town treasury. The theme of local control over schooling developed in these various kinds of schools. The district school system soon entrenched itself in New England because it was inexpensive to finance and gave some measure of schooling to every child. Laws made attendance compulsory, but they were not very rigorously enforced. Some towns allowed girls to have 1 or 2 hours of instruction between 5 and 7 a.m. when boys were not using the school building. For the most part, however, girls had no access to the town elementary schools until after the American Revolution. If few girls went to school in the towns, even fewer did so in the outlying districts. The theme of universal education, which would include girls, was not to develop until the next century. Students entered school around age 6 or 7 and stayed in school for only 3 or 4 years. They learned their ABCs, numerals, and the Lord's Prayer from a horn book, which consisted of a page that was laminated with a transparent material made from boiled down cow horns and then attached to a flat piece of wood. Having learned the basics, students graduated to the New England Primer, an illustrated book composed of religious texts and other readings. Although other primers and catechisms existed, the New England Primer was the most famous and remained the basic school text for at least 100 years after the first edition was published in 1690. The learning atmosphere of these colonial schools was repressive and grim. Students were under orders to keep quiet and do their work, and learning was characterized by an emphasis on memorization. If students did well, they were praised and given a new task. If they did poorly, they were criticized harshly and often given a rap across the knuckles or on the seat of the pants. If children did not pay attention, their lack of focus was taken as a sign of how easily the devil could distract them from the path of righteousness. Such views continued to serve as justification for severe classroom discipline throughout the first 250 years of American history. Conditions in the South were quite different from those in New England. Many upper-class Englishmen immigrated to the South, where they established large estates. As opposed to more centralized conditions in New England, and the great distances between southern settlements encouraged plantation owners to educate their children with private tutors, who were often local ministers or itinerant scholars. As in England, education of the poor and orphans was often undertaken by the Anglican Church or by religious groups, such as the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. The Society's main mission was to convert natives and slaves to Christianity. Most Southern settlers were members of the Anglican Church and did not share the Puritan beliefs that everyone had a religious obligation to learn to read. The lack of concern from general education of the entire community caused public education in the South to lag behind that of other regions of the country for many generations. Town governments established schools, but their administration was usually delegated to a group or corporation which would collect tuition, own property, hire and fire teachers, and decide curriculum content. Unlike Puritan New England and the Anglican Southern colonies, the Middle colonies were composed of various religious and ethnic groups. Quakers, Catholics, Mennonites, Huguenots, Baptists, and others each wished to train their children their respective faiths. And Dutch, German, and Swedish settlers also wanted a separate education for their children. As a result, private venture schools, which were licensed but not protected or financed by the civil government, flourished, and the use of public funds to educate everyone did not become customary. In these private schools, parents paid the teacher directly on a contractual basis. Instructors managed the schools and curriculum, accepting or rejecting students as desired. The denominational schools in the Middle colonies shared the New England concern for proper religious training as a primary goal, but they also began early to offer, in addition to the basics, practical subjects such as bookkeeping or navigation. Before the American Revolution, the term common school referred to schools that provided education for the average person, albeit not necessary at public expense or available to all. Even in colonial New England, parents had to pay for their children's schooling. In the first blush of the new republic, however, conditions began to favor universal education. Yet the idea that some sort of elementary education would be provided free at public expense and under public control for everyone who could not afford or do not want private schooling. Even though the Constitution had regulated control of education to the states, the impetus for such public schooling came from the federal government in particular as a result of the enactment of the Northwest Ordinances of 1785 and 1787. Concerned with the sale of public lands in the Northwest Territory, Congress passed the Northwest Ordinance of 1785. Every township was divided into 36 sections, of which one was set aside for the maintenance of public schools. In the Ordinance of 1778, Congress reaffirmed that religion, morality, and knowledge be necessary to good government and the happiness of manhood. Schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. After the American Revolution, it was recognized that a democratic government would be only as strong as the people's ability to make intelligent choices, which in turn depended on basic education for all. It was also argued that the education was a natural right, just like the very rights for which the Revolution had been fought. During this period, Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson suggested educational plans, as did other leaders of the Revolution. This early period of independence also saw an increased concern with citizenship and nationhood. Leaders perceived that a system of common schooling would strengthen the new nation's unity. An influx of immigrants in the 1840s and 50s, following a period of upheaval in Europe, further stimulated demand for an educational system that would serve to Americanize the waves of foreigners and keep U.S. society stable. In contrast to European social structure, class membership in America was rather fluid. Wealth and social status in this country depended less on the social class into which a person was born. Universal education, one of the key themes of American education, was thus seen by the newly evolving working class as a means of equalizing economic and social opportunities. As a result, another reason given for spreading educational opportunity was that better educated people would increase productivity and enhance everyone's prosperity while diminishing crime and reducing poverty. In fact, school materials of the time reflected this argument, whereas the New England primer reflected the religious orientation of much colonial education. The textbooks of the 19th century began a trend toward secular education, emphasizing morality and Americanism. No other book was more popular than the 6-volume series of McGuffey Readers, which sold more than 100 million copies between 1836 and 1906. Besides training students in English language and grammar, these texts introduced poetry and the writings of statesmen, politicians, moralists, and religious leaders. Although universal education at this time was only meant for whites, the same arguments advanced by its advocates were used later to extend equal opportunities for education to include racial and ethnic minorities and children with disabilities. To name just a few groups that had been denied equal education opportunities in the past, the desegregation efforts of the 1960s and 70s, for example, were based on these very arguments. As proper as these thoughts may sound to the modern ear, they often encountered opposition. The arguments against the public common school were based on economics as much as on educational and political principles. Why should one family pay for the education of another family's children? Many people believed that schooling, especially for the poor, should be the responsibility of religious groups. Still, others thought that a free public school would gradually weaken or dilute the particular culture or religion that they had sought to establish in the United States. If ethnic groups mingled together, what would be the fate of each native's culture and language? Similar concerns are reflected in the current controversies about multicultural and bilingual education discussed in Chapter 3, Who Are Today's Students in a Diverse Society. Educators also struggled with another question: what was to be done about religious study? The ability of different religious groups to exist together in one school, as in democracy itself, demanded that no one religious group be favored over another. Although many competing proposals were advanced, the common schools finally settled on the teachings of basic moral values such as honesty and sincerity as a substitute for direct religious instruction. As described in Chapter 8, one of the ethical and legal issues facing teachers, the same issues continue to inspire controversy today. Between 1820 and 1920, the establishment of common schools made steady progress across the United States. By the middle of the 19th century, and certainly by the end of the Civil War, thanks in large part to the efforts of Horace Mann and other advocates of the common school, the idea of universal elementary education was generally acknowledged, if not universally practiced. By 1930, 11 states and the District of Columbia had passed compulsory attendance laws in addition to making common schools generally available. As a result of these efforts between the Civil War and World War I, the number of students in schools grew enormously. In 1870, 57% of children between 5 and 18 years old were enrolled in some form of schooling. By 1918, more than 75% of all U.S. children in that age range were enrolled. In 1870, average attendance was 45 days per year. In 1918, it had grown to more than 90 days. Thus, in the 100 years between 1820 and 1920, people saw extraordinary growth in the commitment to free, publicly supported universal education. Elementary education was influenced strongly by European educators, curricular changes, consolidation of school districts, and the ideas of progressive education. From Europe came new ideas about education. One of the most far-reaching experiments was the kindergarten, or children's garden, where pleasant children's activities such as songs and stories were used to lay a foundation before formal education began. Friedrich Froebel of Germany developed the first kindergarten in 1837. The first U.S. experiments with this sort of education were actually made before the Civil War, but it was not until 1873 that a public school kindergarten was established in St. Louis, and the idea spread rapidly. Elizabeth Peabody brought Froebel's idea to the United States, and it was influential in instituting early childhood education in our country. European influence also resulted in greater emphasis on the interests of the children in elementary education. Joanne Pestalozzi modeled his educational doctrines on a Swiss experimental school at the beginning of the 19th century. Pestalozzi attempted to educate the heads, hearts, and hands of his pupils, relying on attitudes of acceptance and love of individual students to reach large numbers of poor and handicapped children. Among his instructional techniques were object lessons, which focused on actual objects and pictures. Pestalozzi also emphasized learning through sense perception and sequencing of learning experiences from the known to the unknown. We can still see the influence of many of Pestalozzi's ideas in American education. German educator Johann Friedrich Herbart, influenced by Pestalozzi's thinking, stressed that the primary purpose of education was moral development. Herbart also established a highly structured mode of teaching that strongly influenced American teachers during the early part of the 20th century. Many European thinkers and American educators influenced by them believed students could learn best by direct experience, that is, by using their senses and relating new learning to their previous knowledge. As a result, some schools incorporated more physical activity and manual training into their curricula. This innovation was designed not to train technical workers, but rather to complement and round out traditional intellectual instruction. Maria Montessori was particularly influential in developing a curriculum that emphasized learning through the senses for young children. The theories espoused by Froebel, Pestalozzi, Herbart, and Montessori, among others, entered American education through their influence on issues of curriculum and instruction. The emphasis on the children's interest and experience, which was advocated by the progressive educators and remains a strong force in American elementary education, owes much of these European thinkers. The movement toward comprehensive education that occurred during this time period exemplifies one of the key themes of the history of American education. During the colonial period, it was hardly necessary for people to know anything beyond the 4 R's unless they were wealthy and wanted to go on to college. In the early and mid-19th century, the common school curriculum simply expanded on the colonial curriculum. The primary concern, however, was less with the religious training and more with the task of obtaining functional knowledge for life after school. Subjects such as spelling, geography, history, and government were added because they were considered important for good citizenship. Instruction in the natural sciences, physical training, and mechanical drawing were also included to provide a complete, well-rounded education. Although the one-room school had served well in the days of the frontier in the 20th century, it became clear that the smaller, poor districts could not provide the educational opportunities available in larger, wealthier ones. As a result, people in the early 1900s saw a period of consolidation of smaller school districts into larger unified systems. In 1910, more than half the states allowed such unification. By the 1920s, the growth of industry and the invention of the automobile had helped consolidate a large number of one-room schools around the country into centrally located modern facilities that could serve larger areas better than the old district schools did. Horace Mann was the radical educational reformer of his day. Born in Franklin, Massachusetts, Mann received only the most rudimentary schooling until he was 15. Most of his education was self-acquired, a fact that profoundly influenced his philosophy of education. He studied hard to be admitted to Brown University, where he became a brilliant student. In 1827, Mann was elected to the Massachusetts House of Representatives. Although a luminous political career was clearly within his grasp, he became committed instead to education and to the use of political methods to bring about educational reform. Asked why he had exchanged the practice of law for education, Mann answered that the interests of a client are small compared to the interests of the next generation. Mann strongly believed in the ideals of the common school and championed its cause throughout his career. He saw education as a tool of liberation by which the poor could raise themselves, African Americans could become emancipated, and children with disabilities could adjust their handicaps. After all, Mann reasoned education had brought his fame and position. Thus, more than 150 years ago, the idea of social mobility through education was born in the U.S. For education to be as powerful a force as Mann envisioned it, he thought the school term must be lengthened and teachers' salaries raised. To make learning more relevant and enjoyable, he helped introduce new textbooks designed to illustrate the relationship between knowledge and the practical problems of society. Mann organized libraries in many schools, making books readily available to students. He believed less in the formal curriculum than in individual learning, undoubtedly because of his own self-education. Mann was intensely interested in teaching preparation, and he believed teachers should serve as intellectual, moral, and cultural models for their communities. He was responsible for the establishment of the Massachusetts Board of Education and for the founding in 1839 of the first public normal school in Lexington, Massachusetts. Although the normal school opened with only 3 students, the concept spread and was widely imitated throughout the country. Another goal of Mann's was to abolish the cruel floggings that were then routine in the public schools. Most schoolmasters of the day believed flogging to be an aid to learning and that it was their duty to drive the devil out of their students. Many of them administered from 10 to 20 floggings a day. Many of Mann's ideas were controversial, but he was most violently denounced for his position on religion in the schools. Although a religious man, he believed religious training belonged outside the school, which should be run by the state. Because of his views, Mann was attacked from many Boston pulpits. Mann was regarded as a dreamer and a visionary by many of his colleagues. When he took over the presidency of Antioch College in 1852, it opened its doors to members of all races and religious sects and admitted women on an equal basis with men. Some educators predicted that these measures would promote the collapse of higher education. Were he alive today, Mann might still be fighting for ideas he espoused more than a century ago, because many people have yet to accept these ideas. John Dewey and other educators tried to create new experimental child-centered schools in the early 1900s. In 1919, the Progressive Education Association was established in a formalized attempt to reform education according to the following principles. The child should have freedom to develop naturally. Natural interests is the best motive for work. The teacher is a guide, not a task-maker. A student's development must be measured scientifically, not just by grades. Students' general health and physical development require attention. The school and home must work together to meet children's needs. The progressive school should be a leader in trying new educational ideas. The progressive school movement eventually went to several different directions. Some educators argued for letting children do whatever they wanted. Others tried to turn the school into a community center for recreation, adult education, and even social reform. Critics ranged from traditionalist advocates of the subject-centered curriculum to some progressives, including Dewey himself, who argued that the ties between society and the child would be broken if children were granted total freedom to do whatever they wanted. The 1940s brought a rather conservative reaction to the progressivism of the previous generation. Even so, many ideas we take for granted now, such as teaching through student projects, field trips, and non-lecture methods of instruction, were hotly debated innovations that were introduced by progressive educators and managed to survive the retrenchment of that era. After World War II, the United States' role in world affairs expanded dramatically, thus broadening the scope of educational objectives for the nation's school. The use of the single textbook was supplemented by a great variety of learning resources. Other majority developments in elementary education included the rapid growth of kindergartens and an emphasis on providing special education programs for children with disabilities. During the period of the 1950s and 60s, we were in what was called the Cold War with the Soviet Union in response to the Soviet launch of the space Satellite Sputnik in 1957, for example, national curriculum projects emphasized mathematics, science, and social studies were developed and implemented in our elementary schools. Also during this period, two types of students received major attention from elementary school educators: the gifted and the disadvantaged. Gifted students received attention because of U.S. concern over the ongoing Cold War with the Soviet Union and the perceived need to produce scientific breakthroughs to ensure U.S. military superiority over the Soviets. As the movement for the civil and human rights gained momentum, an increasing number of curriculum reform movements also focused on culturally disadvantaged children. In response to judicial decisions and protests by minority groups, the federal government advanced significant financial aid in an effort to change schools to better address the needs of these children. Compensatory education programs such as Head Start and Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act improved the learning of disadvantaged children. As achievement tests and scholastic aptitude test scores declined during the 1970s, many parents, politicians, and educators argued that the schools had tried to accomplish too much and had lost sight of their basic purposes. A return to the basics seemed to be the cry for the late 1970s and early 80s. Today, academic rigor continues to emphasize in the form of content standards, but many more programs have been developed to meet the needs of students who are at risk for dropping out. Although a public elementary school education is now available everywhere in the United States, the issues of what constitutes a proper education, how comprehensive it should be, how secular it should remain, and how basic learning should be defined are far from finally settled. The changing nature of what constitutes the basics of education has been another key theme of the history of American education. Today's public comprehensive high school evolved from earlier forms of secondary education that included colonial grammar schools, which were designed to either prepare students for college or for particular careers, and private academies, which were popular throughout the 19th century. Secondary education changed considerably from the colonial period through the 20th century, including different kinds of instruction with different purposes. In the colonial period, all secondary education, that is, all education beyond the elementary level, served the sole purpose of preparing for entrance to college. The earliest secondary institution was the Latin Grammar School, whose name gradually came to mean college preparatory school. The term prep school still carries that classical connotation today. A boy entered a Latin grammar school around age 7 and spent the next 7 years learning Latin and Greek from texts written by ancient Romans, Greeks, or medieval scholars. Much work was memorized, and the student learned composition and writing of Latin verses over 3 or 4 years. He also might have given some attention to the study of the Hebrew language and the New Testament. The first Latin grammar school in the colonies is generally considered to have been the one established in 1635 in Boston. It was public and open to boys of all social classes. The Older Satan Act of 1647, which required communities of 50 or more families to establish elementary schools, also required communities of 100 or more families to establish Latin schools. At first, Latin grammar schools were found primarily in New England. A bit later, they emerged in the middle colonies. The growth of middle-class businesses in the 1700s led to the demand for a secondary education that would provide practical instruction in everything from navigation and engineering to bookkeeping and foreign languages. To meet this demand, private English grammar schools were established. These schools catered to the growing number of students who needed more than elementary instruction but were not interested in preparing for college. Classes were offered at various times and places, sometimes to both boys and girls. Commercial rather than religious subjects were taught. Some subjects, such as music, art, and dancing, were actually not practical, but were meant to train students for socializing in polite company. In the 1700s, private venture English grammar schools were more flexible than the Latin grammar schools, and as a result were the first secondary instructions to accept female students. Depending on the sophistication of the particular school, the preferences of its clientele, girls typically studied the 3 R's. Geography and French, but they also sometimes learned English grammar, history, and Latin. Some practical vocational subjects, such as bookkeeping, were occasionally taught, along with such traditional and socially accepted skills as art and instrumental music. Because of the somewhat larger number of private venture schools in the middle colonies, girls who lived there probably had greater educational opportunities than girls elsewhere. Quaker leaders, including William Penn and French-born Anthony Benezet, were concerned with and supported the education of several deprived groups, such as African Americans and American Indians and women. In the South, the daughter of wealthy landowners could receive traditional instruction in the various arts and letters such as music, dancing, and French, which would give them the social skills appropriate for the lady of a household. By the end of the colonial period, separate class-based education tracks were developed for girls similar to those for boys in the English or Latin grammar schools. A new type of secondary school, known as an academy, emerged during the second half of the 18th century. The academy was an attempt to combine Latin and English grammar schools through separate Latin and English departments within one school. Academies were unlike the Latin grammar schools in that the primary language of the academy was English. They were unlike the English grammar schools in that they included classical subjects in the curriculum. Gradually, the academy took the place of both types of school. The number of private academies grew rapidly after the American Revolution in response to the growing need for practical business training. By 1850, approximately 6,000 academies were in operation. Compared with the Latin grammar schools, the academies included instruction for a larger age range, which on the low end overlapped the curriculum of the common schools and of the upper end sometimes provided instruction that was as extensive as that of colleges. Although academies first focused on practical useful studies rather than on college preparatory courses, the emphasis over the years shifted back to the classical languages and curriculum. Because they were private institutions, the academies were also at greater liberty to accept girls. The real surge of development in education for girls and young women came in the first half of the 1800s, with the growth of academies and seminaries that were established especially for young women. Female academies were established by Emma Willard in Troy, New York, by Kathleen Beecher in Hartford, Connecticut, and by Mary Leone in South Hadley, Massachusetts. A secondary education acquired at one of these institutions was often the highest level of education women would ever receive. Eventually, some of these academies themselves became colleges, such as Mount Holyoke College and Wheaton College. The female academies had to buck the established norms against formal education for women who in many quarters were still considered intellectually inferior to men. The schools compromised somewhat by offering courses related to home economics in addition to more classical subjects. In practical terms, the leaders of the women's education movement were committed to two goals. First, they sought to produce women who could handle the domestic chores and challenges of wives and mothers intentionally and wisely so as to become companions rather than satellites of their husbands. To meet this goal, the curriculum of female academies was designed to include subjects similar but not identical to those at men's institutions. Domestic skills were presented as practical applications of the more abstract traditional subjects. Second, women's education was intended to prepare women for life as teachers. Although the private academies reflected the democratic independence of the middle class, their tuition and fees effectively ruled out enrollment of members of the proper working class. In the years following the American Revolution, the growing demand for free public elementary education understandably provided a basis on which to advocate for free secondary education, such as schooling at public expense was the educational system's most appropriate for democracy. It was argued in the only system that could maintain democracy. Although by no means universally accepted, the argument for free public high schools was a logical one, based on the inequality of providing elementary schools for everyone, but secondary schools only for those who could afford tuition. In 1821, Boston created the first public English high school. A second one for girls was established in 1826. Unlike the academies, high schools were governed by the public rather than by private school boards. The number of public high schools throughout the states increased slowly but steadily as an extension of the common school system. Not everyone favored their spread. Opponents of the idea of public high schools did not dispute the need for common elementary schools, but did argue that secondary schools was a luxury and was not within the domain of the taxing authorities. In 1874, in the famous Kalamazoo case, the Michigan courts finally ruled that the school district taxed the public to support both high schools and elementary schools. This court case set the precedent for financing public high schools. In the late 19th century, debate shifted from whether public secondary schools should be supported to what the content of the curriculums should be. As remained the case today, guidelines for the curriculum were derived largely from the goals expressed for the schools. One goal was to reduce social tensions and strengthen the democratic form of government by bringing together all social classes and ethnic groups. Another goal was to provide better preparation for Americans to participate on graduation in the full range of industrial occupations. In addition, the high schools were to offer specialized vocational and technical training. At the beginning of the 1800s, the appeal of the academies had been to provide training and studies that prepared students for a practical livelihood and not necessarily for college. By the 1840s, the same goal was being applied to public high schools. Seen in retrospect, the academies were really a link between the earlier grammar school and the latter high school. High schools were supposed to provide both a terminal educational experience for most students and a bridge to higher education for those who were capable and chose to pursue further studies. To meet these varied purposes, the secondary curriculum underwent considerable revisions between the Civil War and World War I. The basic mathematics courses in arithmetic, geometry, and algebra tended to be taught in a more commercial and practical context. American literature began to compete with English literature, and commercial English was added to the study of literary English. The classical languages continued to give way to modern foreign languages. In the sciences, physiology, chemistry, physics, botany, and astronomy were joined by meteorology, zoology, forestry, agriculture, and geology. Physical education was added to the curriculum. In social studies, the number of courses in American history grew. Although European history continued to be central, civics and citizenship were added to history. Moral philosophy fell away completely and was replaced by purely commercial courses such as typing, stenography, commercial law, home economics, industrial arts, and manual training. The result of the instruction known today as the public comprehensive high school, which embodies the notion of comprehensive education, another of the key themes of American education. During the 20th century, public comprehensive high schools continued to spread. Between 1890 and 2010, the number of students in public high schools increased as a percentage of all students attending public school from 1.6% to 29%. For some time, educators debated the best way to divide grade levels for elementary and secondary training. The main question was when to stop teaching basic skills and start teaching content. Should there be 8 elementary grades and 4 secondary school grades, or 6 elementary grades and 6 secondary grades, or some other arrangement? In an attempt to resolve these issues, educators began to experiment with various ways to reorganize the grades. Finally, in the school year 1909-1910, in both Columbus, Ohio and Berkeley, California, a separate program was established for the intermediate grades 7, 8, and 9. This new grouping was called junior high school. By 1926, more than 800 school systems had a 6-3-3 organization, and that pattern became the dominant one. Since the 1960s, the system of 5 elementary, 3 intermediate, 4 secondary grades has become increasingly popular with a middle school being home to grades 6, 7, and 8 rather than a junior high school. Advocates argue that middle schools have significant advantages over junior high schools. For one thing, they offer a unique environment where 10 to 13-year-olds are free to grow up at their own rates and where attention is focused on the needs of this age group rather than on mimicking the high school's emphasis on academic and sports competition, as is often the case with junior high schools. Because of the earlier onset of puberty in today's children, 6th graders may be better served in a school designed for early adolescence in grades 6, 7, and 8 than in an elementary school. Additionally, giving the 9th grade, which is still considered the first year in the college entrance sequence to the high school, frees middle schools to try new programs and new approaches without having to make them specifically applicable to college preparation. Since the mid-1980s, the United States has made a deepening national commitment to improving the education of its early adolescents, with a strong emphasis on personal growth and development. To encourage this kind of personal growth, middle schools often use interdisciplinary team teaching, block scheduling, advisory homerooms, and exploratory activities and courses. At least one report has questioned whether students of this age should be in separate schools. A report from the RAND Corporation portrayed the middle school years as a time when American adolescents feel unsafe, socially isolated, and academically unchallenged, and it called for a reconsideration of standalone middle schools. The RAND report relied on research indicating that young teens do better in K-8 schools than in schools that require a transition to an intermediary school. Additionally, international comparison studies have revealed that the relative performance of U.S. students in math and sciences declines from elementary school to middle school, and national tests of proficiency show that the majority of 8th graders fail to reach proficiency in math, reading, and science. Teachers are the key to what goes on in the classroom. In the past, many states permitted teachers by either elementary or secondary teaching licenses to teach in middle school, but now more of them are upping the academic coursework required of elementary school teachers who want to teach in middle schools in an effort to refocus the middle school curriculum on academic subject matter. A number of states have broadened the licensure eligibility of secondary teachers to allow them to teach levels as low as the 6th grade. 33 states also offer teacher license specifically for middle school that focus on the adolescent development and academic subject matter preparation. The RAND study suggests that the relatively few teachers obtain this type of license. Only 12 to 25% of teachers have specialized training in middle grades education. Look at the pictures of the two secondary classrooms below, one taken in the late 1800s and the other from today. In what ways are they similar? How are they different? The most remarkable observation made about secondary education today is how little it has changed over the last 100 years. There have been changes, of course, but they have been small relative to the dramatic changes that have occurred in American living patterns, values, technologies, and careers. The curriculum revolves around subjects that are taught by specialists and are not very different from the subjects offered at schools during World War I. The reasons for this consistency relate to the basic structure of the high school. Its organizing framework, which is intentionally developed in the 19th century, persists today across all regions of the United States. High schools are complicated organizations requiring considerable orchestration to work efficiently. A change in one part of the system means that other parts must change in tandem. As a result, relatively little change occurs. Private schools have always been part of American education for more than 150 years until the growth of the common school movement in the early 1800s. Most education in the United States was private. Historically, private schools have served three major purposes: providing instructional for various religious dominations, an exclusive education for the wealthy, and an alternative for any group that finds the available forms of education unsatisfactory. Since the middle of the 19th century, by far the largest private school enrollments have been in parochial schools run by the Roman Catholic Church. The earliest Catholic schools existed primarily in the Spanish-speaking Southwest and in French-speaking Louisiana. After 1840, however, Irish and Italian immigration increased the support of Catholic instruction in the North and East. The total number of Catholic schools grew from about 100 in 1840 to about 3,000 in the 1880s, to 8,000 in 1920, and more than 13,000 in the early 1960s. From that point, however, many Catholic schools have closed. Today, the number of Catholic schools is slightly less than 6,700. In terms of enrollment, Catholic schools now have a total student membership of about 2 million, compared with an estimated 1.68 million students in other religious schools, and an estimated 890,000 in non-sectarian private schools. There are more than 3,860 private schools with a total enrollment of about 4.5 million, or about 8.3% of all students in U.S. schools. About 68% of private schools enrolling about 80% of private school students have religious orientation. In Chapter 13 offers more information about teaching opportunities in private schools. The steady reduction in the percentage of private school students in the 19th and early 20th century was not merely a sign of public school strength. It also reflected outright discrimination and pressure against those who wanted it to be different. In an extreme case following World War I, Nebraska passed a law prohibiting the teaching of German in either public or private schools. However, in 1922, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that a state could not interfere with the prerogative of parents to educate their children as they see fit, in this case a private school that taught the German language, simply on the grounds of desiring to foster a more homogeneous people with American ideals. When in 1925 an Oregon law required all children to attend public school, a Roman Catholic school and another private school successfully challenged the law on the grounds that their 14th Amendment rights were being threatened. In a landmark decision in Pierce v. The Society of Sisters, the Supreme Court overturned the Oregon law, holding that the act unreasonably interferes with the liberty of parents and guardians to direct the upbringing and education of children under their control. As a consequence of this decision, non-public schools survived efforts to eliminate them. Public schools have clearly become the principal mode of education in the United States. Nevertheless, private education has remained an important alternative for about 10% of the population. This fact reflects a paradox. On the one hand, in the early days, private schools have represented the freedom of immigrant groups to pursue life in America and to educate their children as they choose. That privilege was essential to the young democracy and still represents a basic freedom of choice in America. On the other hand, some argue that private education supports a caste system that is, in principle, undemocratic. The very existence of private schools, of private forms of education, can be viewed as an implied criticism of either of the quality of public education or of its ability on equal terms to all comers, irrespective of class, religions, or race. As discussed in detail in Chapter 12, How Should Education Be Reformed? This issue has become more prominent as school vouchers plans expand to include private and religious school options. The picture of American education that we have drawn up to now has been quite rosy because the educational achievements of this country over the past 350 years are clearly impressive. There is, however, a less pleasant side to the picture. The history of education provides insight into people's values in general, and the educational experiences of minorities tends to reflect how society relates to them. The somewhat idealized image of the melting pot begins to break down when we look at the experience of non-white groups. The United States is a multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multi-class society. Indeed, many people consider it to be one of the most successful mixed societies the world has ever seen. Even so, it is far from perfect, and many children born into poor minority group families face severe disadvantages in their attempts to live decent lives and to climb the ladder of success. Schooling is intended to help individuals in this process. Traditionally, however, ethnic minorities such as African Americans, Hispanic Americans, American Indians, and Asian Americans have not been given equal educational opportunity in the U.S. Not until the late 19th century, for example, did the federal government make any serious effort to provide education for American Indians. Many groups struggled throughout the 19th century and 20th centuries to claim their share of the growing across to education that developed for the majority of white students. American society is still suffering today from the effects of educational neglect of various minority groups. In our coverage of the education of minorities, we often discuss members of minority groups as though they were a homogeneous subgroup of Americans. In reality, the terms African Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, and American Indians encompass many ethnic, national, and linguistic groups. Although it is inconvenient to use these broader terms, we should not forget that great diversity exists within each subgroup. For African Americans, the struggle of equal access to schooling and education paralleled the growth of education for the majority, beginning with efforts to simply provide schools. Efforts throughout the 20th century focused next on offering a broader variety of curriculum options to African American students, and then on removing legal obstacles to equality of education. As is true of colonial education, generally, the earliest motivation to educate African Americans was religious. In New England, Reverend Cotton Mather started an evening school for slaves as early as 1717. In the South, the first attempts to educate African Americans was carried out by clergy, particularly English representatives of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. To dubious slave owners, ministers defended the education of slaves not only as a religious duty to save their souls, but also because conversion to Christianity, it was believed, would make them more docile. In the North, schools were established for free African Americans. In 1731, Anthony Benezet, a French-born Quaker, started a school for slave and free African American children in Philadelphia. In 1774, another school was begun by Benjamin Franklin as president of the Abolitionist Society. In 1787, an African free school was established in New York City with an enrollment of 40 students, which grew to more than 500 by 1820. The city provided funds in 1824 and took over the school in 1834, thus providing education for African Americans before many white children were receiving it. Yet conditions were not all bright in the North. In 1833, Prudence Crandall, a white schoolmistress in Canterbury, Connecticut, began to take in African American girls. The villagers boycotted the school, threw manure into its well, and tried to burn it down. Finally, a mob broke the windows and the school was closed. In the South, following slave rebellions in the early 1800s, the state gradually prohibited altogether the teaching of African American children. Whether slave or free, some slaves were taught to read by favorably disposed masters. More generally, slave owners reasoned that reading would lead to thinking and thinking would lead to the desire for freedom. As the Civil War approached, abolitionist agitation often emerged from the few liberal colleges that allowed the enrollment of African American students, such as Oberlin College in Ohio and Bowdoin College in Maine. In the period following the Civil War, the seeds for the education of African Americans that had been sown before the war slowly began to sprout. During the period of Reconstruction from 1865 into the 1870s, the federal government throughout the Freedmen's Bureau and in the former Confederacy and occupying army attempted to promote African American voting, registration, and schooling. Help also came from private and religious philanthropies in the North. Because it was hoped that whites would also benefit from these endeavors, schooling was advocated for the general public as well. Despite these efforts, the common school movement remained weakest in the South. At first, most whites there refused to participate, not only in integrated schools, but also in segregated schools, both of which they believed the Northern carpetbaggers were forcing on them. By the end of the Reconstruction, Southern whites began to allow the existence of separate schools for African Americans. African American enrollment in the schools, which had been only 2% of the school-aged children in 1850, reached 10% in 1870 and 35% in 1890, although it dropped somewhat after that. During a period of severe repression by the new white state governments, during this period, Jim Crow laws were passed separating African Americans from whites in all areas of life. Into these conditions, a young African American teacher named Booker T. Washington was called to start an African American normal school in Tuskegee, Alabama in 1881. Originally named the Tuskegee Normal School for Colored Teachers, it was later renamed the Tuskegee Institute. In Tuskegee, Washington found only a few students, no buildings or classrooms, and a hostile white community. Washington, who had been born a slave, thought that the traditional curriculum of the classics would neither prepare his students to help other African Americans learn nor help ameliorate the tensions with the white community. Believing strongly in the idea of learning by doing, Washington instructed his students to build the school themselves. In this process, they learned practical skills, grew produce that could be sold to the white community, and in general showed the whites that African Americans could be productive members of society. Washington gradually came to be considered the outstanding African American leader of the time by the white establishment. Over time, a growing number of young African Americans who, unlike Washington, had not been born into slavery, came to believe that Washington's conciliatory policy of training for menial positions in white society would not benefit African American people in the long run. They suggested that although practical training was necessary, an intellectually sound and academically rich program of study must be established for the talented tenth of the student body who would form the African American intellectual leadership. This was the view of W.E.B. Du Bois, an African American intellectual and scholar who held a doctorate from Harvard. In 1862, the U.S. Congress passed the Morrill Act. This legislation granted each state a minimum of 3,000 acres of federal land, with the proviso that the income for the rent or sale of these lands must be used to establish colleges for the study of agriculture and mechanical arts. A total of 6 million acres of federal land were donated to the states. The resulting land grant institutions such as the University of Illinois, Texas A&M, and Michigan State became the great multipurpose state universities that now enroll hundreds of thousands of students from all segments of society. In 1890, Congress enacted a second Morrill Act that increased the endowment of land to the original land grant colleges, but forbade the granting of money to a college with an admission policy that discriminated against non-whites unless a separate facility for African Americans existed nearby. This second Morrill Act provided federal support to states to create separate but equal colleges for African Americans. As a result of this legislation, a number of so-called 1890 institutions were created for the higher education of African Americans. Many of these historically African American colleges, such as Florida A&M, North Carolina, AT&T, still exist today, albeit now as integrated institutions. In 1896, in the case of Plessy v. Ferguson, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of separate but equal accommodations for African Americans. Although the ruling originally referred to seating in a railroad car, it was quickly extended to schools. The practical significance of this ruling was its federal sanction of the legal separation of African American school children from white children, most notably in the South, a condition that would persist for the next 53 years. The fact that Southern schools for African Americans were not equal to those for whites is woefully clear from looking at financial expenditures alone. In 1912, the Southern states as a group paid white teachers slightly more than $10 per white child, but paid African American teachers less than $3 per African American child. In the 1930s, in 10 Southern states, African American children accounted for 34% of the school population, but received only 3% of the funds available for school transportation. Discrimination also existed in the distribution of federal funds, particularly in vocational education, the largest and most important educational program subsidized by the federal government. Most northern states did not have de jure school segregation, that is, segregation by law. Nevertheless, the crowding of African Americans into isolated neighborhoods often resulted in de facto school segregation, that is, segregation resulting primarily from residential patterns. Furthermore, a large number of Southern African American children who migrated with their parents to northern cities often had to be demoted because they had not mastered the same amount of material as their northern counterparts. Generally, even in the North American, teachers taught African American children. For a valid first-hand description of one educator's experience in segregated schools, read this chapter's Voices from the Classroom feature. College diploma and job contract in hand, I headed to my first teaching job in a small, rural, segregated school. The advice, help, and insights provided by the experienced principal and teachers that first year convinced me that teaching was indeed a good career choice. It mattered not that the new books they were excited about receiving turned out to be the used books from the white school, and that the children had to walk fairly long distances to get to school because there was no bus transportation provided for them. The belief that a new school year meant new opportunity to help children created an unbelievable aura of new beginnings. I later became a teacher in a segregated school in a large urban school district, a school serving students from 3 public housing units. Again, new books, except for newly adopted state textbooks, included used books from other schools. Although repairs, if made at all, were taken care of after the needs of the white schools had been attended to, one of the most powerful insights from both of these experiences was how important the teacher was to the life of the students and community in which they lived. I taught more than the basic academic skills to students. I assumed the role of family social worker, financial advisor, and any other roles necessary to help students and their parents believe that the school was there for them. I had to convince the student and parent that getting a good education was the key to a better future. I took it as my responsibility to help them learn that segregation was only a barrier if we let it become one. I became the principal of that urban school after 10 years of teaching it. Shortly thereafter, the school was integrated, and we became a mix of low-income African American and middle-class white students. It was bittersweet to see much of the maintenance work that had been requested but never done suddenly being taken care of without my having to submit work order requests. It was humiliating to have white parents come and give the woodwork and cafeteria equipment and the white glove treatment, but it was as equally rewarding to know that their fears would be unfounded because my belief that the school should be a clean and safe place for any student and staff member assigned there. Because we already had excellent teachers, a strong academic program, and a belief and a requirement of strong parental involvement, integration proceeded more smoothly than in some of the other schools. Although these conditions persisted in varying degrees to the 1940s, some gains were achieved. For example, the average daily attendance of African American children increased and approached that of white students. The salaries of African American teachers also increased, reducing the economic gap between African American and white teachers with equal training. In the late 1940s, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People began taking cases dealing with inequality in educational opportunities to the courts. Beginning with universities rather than elementary schools, the NAACP succeeded in having the courts rule that various law school facilities for African Americans were clearly unequal to those for whites. The stage was set for the precedent-shattering case of Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, in which the Supreme Court ruled that separate education facilities are inherently unequal and that laws requiring white and now non-white students to go to different schools were illegal. This decision held that segregated schools are inherently unequal because the effects of such schools are likely to differ. Thus, a new component was introduced into the theme of educational opportunity. Equality of educational opportunity became defined in terms of the effects rather than the provisions of schooling. Before Brown, The community and educational institutions were expected only to provide equal resources, such as teachers, facility, and materials. Responsibility for the best use of those resources lay with the child and the child's family. In the Brown decision, the Supreme Court found that even if the facilities and teacher salaries provided were identical, equality of educational opportunity would not exist in segregated schools. In the decades since then, many people have come to consider it the responsibility of the educational institution, not the child, to create achievement. In Brown v. the Board of Education, the Supreme Court concluded that the de jure school segregation violated the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. Early desegregation efforts, therefore, were aimed at eliminating de jure segregation. Throughout the 1960s and into the 70s, many school systems, often in response to specific court orders, also attempted to reduce or eliminate de facto school segregation. As a result, many school districts underwent desegregation efforts. What have been the result of those efforts? Several researchers have concluded that desegregated schools have accomplished more than mere educational reform. That is, African American students who attended integrated schools experienced desegregation in several aspects of adult life, including attending predominantly white colleges and universities, working in desegregated settings, and living in desegregated neighborhoods. Although these long-range findings are quite positive, desegregation efforts have produced some negative results. One major problem has concerned busing. Busing students to desegregated schools was one of the most inflammatory issues in education in the 70s and 80s. Emotions on the topic often ran very high, so high in fact that white parents sometimes slashed bus tires, burned buses, and physically prevented buses from running to avoid having their children bused to other schools. Busing to achieve desegregation has experienced mixed success. One of the most successful busing plans began in Berkeley, California in 1968 without any disruptive incidents. Standardized test scores subsequently indicated that white, African American, Asian American students all made better progress after desegregation. In many other communities, attempts to desegregate the schools by busing met with tremendous community resistance. By the end of the 80s, the court order busing was no longer the preferred method for integrating the schools. Busing, of course, was never an end in itself. It was merely one means of integrating school society, and polls indicate that even opponents of involuntary busing agree that our society needs to be integrated. However, that goal remains elusive. A major obstacle to desegregating big city public schools is that the minority percentage of inner city populations has increased dramatically during the past several decades. In part, this trend has been the result of white flight, the exodus of white residents as parents have chosen to move to the suburbs or place their children in private schools. Today, cities such as New York, LA, Chicago, Detroit, Atlanta, Houston, and Dallas have school minority enrollments over 90%. How can schools in major cities be desegregated when the percentage of racial minority students is growing and the percentage of white students is decreasing? In addition, several Supreme Court decisions during the 1990s dramatically reversed school desegregation plans ordered by lower courts, thereby eliminating much of the pressure to desegregate schools. In these rulings, the court essentially conceded that the practical limits exist as to what a federal court can do remedy prior discrimination. Once school districts have corrected the initial racial imbalances, they are not required to remedy subsequent imbalances caused by demographic changes. In a 2007 ruling, the Supreme Court, by a 5-4 margin, further backed away from desegregation efforts by striking down plans in Seattle and Louisville that sought to maintain school-by-school diversity by identifying students by race and assigning them to schools based on that classification. Increasingly segregated residential patterns and the slackening of legal pressures to desegregate during the 80s and 90s have led to a phenomenon known as resegregation, in which schools are becoming more segregated again. Evidence suggests that resegregation of African Americans has reached the levels seen before 1970. 74% of black students attend majority non-white schools, and 38% of black students attend intensely segregated schools. In large urban centers, the percentage of African American students is much higher. Although many political and educational leaders remain committed to desegregated schools, others are questioning whether integration is an idea whose time has passed. In many communities, these leaders, who are typically members of minority groups, call for shifting the emphasis from integrating schools to improving the quality of one-race neighborhood schools. They have lost faith in the idea that desegregation is the answer to call for better schools. These supporters of resegregation argue that it demeans African American children to believe that they can learn only when they sit next to white children in desegregated schools. Some also think that the resegregation will protect African American culture from the gradual eradication that would occur in an integrated setting. Further, they argue resegregation would relieve African Americans of the disproportionate burden they have carried under most desegregation arrangements. Supporters of desegregation counter with the argument that most parents are mainly interested in good schools for their own children, not for the children of others. Accordingly, they say all whites will support only African American students who happen to be in school with their own children. Thus, if African American children are to benefit educationally, they need to attend school with white children. Otherwise, resegregation forces poor, largely African American school districts into cities with a low tax base to continue their losing struggle and to find educational money that they don't have. As one advocate for desegregating ways who favor resegregations are doing whites the great favor of relieving both their guilty consciences and their pocketbooks. Another point must be made before we close this discussion, namely desegregation does not necessarily lead to integration. True integration is a very human process that can occur only after desegregation has gone into effect. It happens when people from different racial and ethnic backgrounds learn to become comfortable with one another and to get along together. Integration means ending racial prejudice and respecting ethnic differences. Anyone who has spent time in racially mixed schools, especially high schools, knows that African American and white students who attend the same school can still be extremely distant from one another. Just bringing together students from different racial groups, social classes, and neighborhood backgrounds will not automatically lead to friendship, understanding, and appreciation for one another. As long as the larger society remains segregated, efforts to integrate our schools are likely to produce tension, at least in the short run. Integrating schools, which with increasingly diverse racial, cultural, and linguistic backgrounds, remains one of the key themes and challenges to schools and society. As early as 1622, in an ominous foreshadowing of future policies, one colonist wrote back to England that it was easier to conquer the Indians than to civilize them. The education of American Indians traditionally received less public attention than that of African Americans because American Indians were considered an impediment to westward expansion. They were far from the major population centers, and their dealings were largely with the federal government. Initially, the education of American Indians, like that of African Americans, had a religious purpose. Once they had been put on reservations, American Indians received schooling from missionaries who attempted to civilize them through the 3 R's, and of course the 4th R, religion. In the 1890s, these missionary schools were gradually replaced by government boarding schools, which tried to forcibly assimilate American Indians into the mainstream culture by prohibiting them from speaking their native language and teaching them skills associated with white society, such as farming and mechanical skills for boys and domestic chores for girls. Little emphasis was placed on academics. The people who had been living in the North American continent for 20,000 years finally became American citizens in 1924, but that did not mean they controlled their own education. The federal government, through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, directed the education of American Indians into the mid-1970s. During this time, American Indian participation was virtually ignored and was acknowledgement of their own culture and their educational programs. By 1965, American Indians had began to demand control of their schools, and a few demonstration sites for such tribal schools were funded. These schools were able to include much of the native culture in their curricula, but they remained financially dependent of the federal government, which meant limited instructional materials and lower paid teachers than in many public schools. Between 1972 and 1975, Congress enacted 3 bills that affected American Indian education and self-determination. These bills encouraged the establishment of community-run schools, offered grants to develop culturally relevant and bilingual curriculum materials, and establish an advisory council made up of American Indians. The Department of the Interior's BIA is still actively involved in educational matters, though it now acts in a supportive rather than directive capacity. The federal government has shifted much responsibility for educating American Indians from the BIA and tribal schools to public schools. The BIA runs 183 schools on 64 reservations, primarily located in Arizona, New Mexico, North Dakota, and South Dakota. Approximately 2/3 of the schools are operated by Indian tribes or tribal organizations under grants or contracts with the BIA. The schools serve over 41,000 students. About 6% of all American Indian students enrolled in K-12 schools in the United States. The other 94% of American Indian students in grades K-12 attend public schools. This trend may have helped reduce the isolation of American Indian students. However, because American Indian community involvement in public education is slight, the move toward public schooling has resulted in the loss of the limited control American Indians have begun to exercise over the education of their children receive. Today, the education of the American Indian population in the United States, about 582,000 students, or 1.2% of the school-age population, is still plagued by problems such as poverty, parental alcoholism, underachievement, absenteeism, overage students, and a high dropout rate. Indeed, American Indian students drop out of school more often than members of any other racial group except Hispanics. Many American Indians believe that a culturally appropriate curriculum is needed to overcome these deficiencies and reduce the cultural discontinuities between home and school. Only a small percentage of American Indian students have teachers from their same tribe. Most of their teachers are white females. One evaluation of American Indian schools concluded that they should integrate their programs into a whole school standards-based reform effort and increase the participation of the American Indian community. The No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 posed challenges to American Indian students who have a long history of struggling on standardized tests, particularly because of their limited English proficiency. States can craft versions of the test in their native language, but that is unrealistic for many states because of the many dialects spoken. Many American Indian schools also face a tough time in meeting the law's mandate that all teachers be highly qualified. In addition, educators worry about the federal law's call for scientifically based research in creating school curricula and instructional practices. Most of the methods of integrating native culture and language into classroom teaching had not undergone the same level of research scrutiny as those used with non-white American Indian populations, creating concern among American Indian educators that these methods will wither away. As with American Indians, the first contact Spanish-speaking people had with the United States was often a result of annexation and warfare. Although they have lived in the continental United States for more than 400 years, Hispanic Americans came into substantial contact with whites about 200 years ago. And almost from the beginning, there was a cultural clash. Hispanic American children first attended religious mission schools, which were gradually replaced by secular public schools. In the process, the Spanish language and Hispanic American culture were subjected to a type of discrimination that was perhaps less blatant than that against African Americans, just as pervasive. The common school of the 19th and 20th centuries, although it opened educational and social opportunities for some minority students, often sealed off those opportunities for Hispanic Americans. Hispanic children tended to receive lower scores than white children on English language intelligence quotient tests, which not only were written in a language that was not their own, but also reflected white middle-class values. All of these factors combined to reinforce an image of Hispanic American children as intellectually inferior to their white counterparts. Today, almost 70% of Hispanic American students speak Spanish at home. These students are likely to have parents who have much education than those who speak mostly English at home. Children whose parents have not completed high school and who do not speak English are less likely to receive at home the background skills and knowledge to begin school successfully. Schools need to develop programs to address the needs of these students, particularly those with limited English proficiency. Because of increased tax burdens, some states enacted laws to deny a public education for children of illegal immigrants. However, in 1982, the U.S. Supreme Court, in the case of Plyer v. Doe, struck down a Texas statute that denied free education funding for children of illegal immigrants. The court ruled that the Texas law was a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which guarantees rights to people, not citizens, because undocumented immigrant children are people. The court majority found that the Texas law discriminated against children based on a legal characteristic over which the children had little control, namely the fact of their having been brought illegally into the United States by their parents. The court's majority also observed that denying the children in question of a proper education would likely contribute to the creation and perpetuation of a subclass of illiterates within our boundaries, surely adding to the problems and costs of unemployment, welfare, and crime. The majority refused to accept that any substantial state interest would be served by discrimination on this basis, and it struck down the Texas law. Since the 1940s, the courts have acknowledged that de facto segregation exists between white and Hispanic American school children and have required corrective integration plans. The 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act provided new support to the education of Hispanic Americans just as it did to the education of American Indians. Another response has been the establishment of bilingual education programs to provide students with instruction in their native tongue at the same time they learn English. The goal of such bilingual education programs is for students to enter the English language curriculum at the appropriate age levels for their grades. However, as mentioned in Chapter 3, bilingual education programs have fallen out of favor in recent years and have been replaced with English immersion programs in such states as California and Arizona. Although significant progress has been made, much concern remains about the education of Hispanics in the United States. For example, the high school completion rate for Hispanic Americans over the age of 25 is only 62%, compared with 92 and 83% for whites and African Americans, respectively. Approximately 13% of Hispanic adults have earned bachelor's degree, compared with 33 and 20% of whites and African Americans. Furthermore, reading and mathematics proficiencies are slightly lower for the Hispanic American population in comparison with the white population. The public schools have not served these students well, and the cost of this failure in human economic terms is enormous. Hispanic American youth represent the fastest growing segment of the U.S. population. About 1 in 5 children in the public schools is Hispanic. Demographers project that increasingly higher percentages of Hispanic American students will be enrolled in public schools in the 21st century. So the school's responses to these students' needs will have important consequences for society. The problem is made even more acute by the estimated 11 million illegal immigrants living in the United States. Without increased educational attainment, Hispanic Americans, both legal and illegal, will be regulated to low-skilled jobs and locked into the lowest socioeconomic brackets with negative consequences for all Americans. The diversity of Asian Americans is evident from the historical beginnings of different groups of Asian Americans in the United States, and it persists in educational issues today. The 3 largest groups of Asian Americans are individuals of Chinese, Filipino, and Japanese heritage. Discrimination against early Asian Americans was rampant, especially in the West, where most Asian Americans originally settled. Although immigrants from China, the Philippines, and Japan often entered the United States to fulfill the need for hard labor jobs, white resented the competition for employment. Exclusionary laws limiting immigration to these groups were passed in the late 1800s and early 1900s. School segregation of Chinese American children in California lasted until at least 1946. Japanese American children in California were forced to attend segregated schools up until World War II. With the outbreak of World War II, the yellow peril perceived and emanating from Japanese Americans resulted in the imprisonment and detention camps of more than 110,000 Japanese Americans, most of whom were American-born citizens. With the end of World War II, discrimination against Asian Americans began to subside. Naturalization rights were eventually extended to resident Asian aliens. Many Asian Americans benefited from greater job opportunities during the post-World War II expansion of the U.S. economy. Previously established immigration restrictions were lifted in 1965, and the influx of Asian immigrants greatly increased. Since the U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam in 1975, enormous numbers of Indo-Chinese immigrants have journeyed to the United States and entered our school systems. Asians and Pacific Islanders currently account for approximately 5% of all students enrolled in the public elementary and secondary schools, and this figure is expected to continue to rise for the foreseeable future. Current census estimates indicate that the Asian Pacific Islanders number roughly 18.9 million, or about 6% of the U.S. population. Owing to the higher educational achievement and income levels of Asian Americans, this group has often been touted as a model minority that has overcome discrimination through hard work, perseverance, and industriousness. This rosy stereotype is misleading, however. Compliancy in meeting the educational needs and concerns of Asian American students. The success levels achieved by more recent Asian American immigrants have varied because of the range of educational levels and previous social economic circumstances associated with these new Americans. Many recent Asian American immigrants to the United States have little or no knowledge of the English language. Almost 77% of Asian Americans spoke a language other than English at home. This issue creates formidable language and cultural barriers for students entering the U.S. educational system, and it may lead to serious family school discontinuities alienation from school, and dropout problems. The Supreme Court established in Lau v. Nichols that schools must offer students sufficient special instruction to be afforded equal educational opportunity. Parental and community involvement of Asian Americans in the educational process also should be fostered, in part because of the respect traditionally accorded to educators in their native countries. Parents of Asian American students often hesitate to intervene when they are dissatisfied with their children's educational progress, instead deferring to the educational system's authority. Another deterrent to parental participation is the fact that a high proportion of American Asian families have two parents employed, a situation that makes attendance of traditional teacher conferences or parent-teacher organizations meeting difficult. Many communities are making efforts to organize the voice the needs of Asian American students. As the number of Asian American students continues to grow, it will become increasingly important for teachers and administrators to be knowledgeable about and sensitive to the special problems and needs of Asian American students and their families. To serve these students adequately in our schools, educators must keep in mind that Asian Americans are a changing and complex group whose achievement, aspirations, and learning styles should not be regulated to a simplistic stereotype. From our discussion of the education of minority students, it is clear that even today, large numbers of minority group students are leaving school without the academic and occupational skills necessary to function effectively in American society. The same is true of poor students from all ethnic groups. Who, if anyone, is to blame for this situation? The schools, the students, the families, teachers, and administrators? Is the responsibility that of society as a whole, and are the schools merely being made a scapegoat? Talk to 5 different people and you will probably hear 5 different opinions about where the blame should be fixed. At one extreme are those who think the problem resides in the so-called deficiencies of poor and minority children. Their impoverished home life, their particular cultural milieu, English language deficiencies, and even their mental capacities are cited as the sources of their unequal results in school. At the other extreme are those who claim the problem lies with the school. Some suggest that the problem is linked to the way schools are governed and financed. Numerous court cases have challenged the school's finance system in various states, changing that when educational spending in rich school districts exceeds that of poor districts by 2 or 3 times, students in the poor districts are not getting access to equal educational opportunities. In a number of cases, courts have ordered legislators to redesign the school finance system. Others believe that teaching must be improved, that teachers today neither stimulate nor instruct poor and minority children with the intensity that is needed. Teachers expect these children to do poorly. They claim, and this expectation becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. As described in Chapter 3, this position assumes that the school's obligation to diagnose the learner's needs concerned in cognitive and affective styles and to adjust its program accordingly. In fact, the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001, which requires schools to report the academic performance of students in various racial and ethnic groups, is intended to close the academic achievement gaps between white and Asian American students on the one hand, and on the other hand among African American, Hispanic American, and American Indian students. Not everyone accepts this assertion, of course. In fact, many argue that the school should do its best to provide equal educational resources for all its students, but cannot be held accountable for differences in student learning. As with most controversies, the real answer probably lies somewhere in between these two extremes. Many poor and minority students do come to school with certain deficiencies, but the schools need to learn how to overcome them. End of Chapter 10.